This program is sponsored in part by the Reinhardt Foundation, located in San Diego and dedicated to community projects in Mexico and Guatemala, helping others help themselves.
Hello, my name is Jeffrey Davidow, and we're talking today from the Institute of the Americas on the campus of the University of California, San Diego. This is one of the series of Encuentros in which we invite leading personalities in Latin America to talk about important issues of politics and economics in this hemisphere. Our guest today is Ambassador Milos Alcalay. Ambassador Alcalay was Venezuela's most senior and most distinguished diplomat. He was serving as Venezuela's ambassador to the United Nations and was on his way to be Venezuela's ambassador to the Court of St. James in London. Before we begin our conversation with Ambassador Alcalay, here is some background. On February 27th of this year, he was in Caracas, Venezuela, attending a meeting of the G15 group. That is a group of 15 nations that have come together to promote economic and social plans for what used to be called third world nations. On the same day, tens of thousands of Venezuelans sought to present to President Hugo Chavez and to the leaders of the group of 15 a petition rejecting the fact that the National Electoral Council of Venezuela had previously rejected over 1 million signatures out of a total of 3.5 million signatures calling for the resignation, or at least calling for a referendum that could lead to the resignation of President Chavez. President Chavez's security forces responded with great violence. People were killed, others were captured and tortured. Milos Alcalay, a career diplomat, chose at that point to resign in protest. He is here with us now. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey.
What's happened to Venezuela? For years it was held up as the ideal democratic state in Latin America during the 1960s and 70s, when other countries, Chile, Argentina, Peru, were living under dictatorships. Venezuela had a functioning two-party system, its economy was growing, and yet, as we look at Venezuela today, to use a technical term, it looks like a mess. What's happened?
Well, Jeff, I would say that there are two aspects. One, that the world is changing today, and I think that Venezuela is part of the changement. And it's not enough to have had a good democracy that we had for decades, but how to adapt the situation of Venezuela to the future. United Nations is changing, Africa is changing, Asia is changing, Europe has changed. The collapse of the communist regime showed that it could not continue in the same way that it was. So first, Venezuela is part of the world, and the needs of accomplishing the democratic aspects to a new democracy, you cannot do it without democracy, and this is the first part of your question. Something is clear in Latin America: we cannot go to the military aspect of the geopolitical vision of military power. And the second part that concerns directly Venezuela, not only that Venezuela did not jump to the needs of a new avant-garde in the democracy, but that it went back to the worst situation that Latin America already knew in the 60s and 70s: violation of human rights, corruption, the orientation for a militarization of power. So I would say that not only that the democracy of Venezuela and of all Latin America has to go ahead, but also in our case, we came, and you were mentioning 27 February, to a very cynical attitude of power against the people, and that is why I stood against, and as a Democrat, as a diplomat for democracy, I had to quit my job.
I want to talk about the 27th of February and what's happening with Chavez, but I think you've said something important. When we look at democracy around the world, and some of the things you're saying can apply to Eastern Europe or other democratizing parts of the world, we tend to think that if a country has free elections and multiple political parties, more or less free press, that is a sufficient level of democracy. But what you seem to be saying was that in some ways, those elements which existed in Venezuela for almost 40 years created a hollow democracy that was not really giving benefits to the population, and finally the population found itself fed up with the political system, and that allowed Hugo Chavez to be elected, because he was elected. He was very popular when he was elected. Why was Hugo Chavez elected?
Well, he was elected because of that collapse of the political traditional parties. And the political parties did not deliver the needs of a better quality of life for the people.
Why not? Why not?
Because there are a series of national and international conditions that we have to think very much deeply, and I think that a center like the University of California and the universities and the academicians must think of how to deliver a better quality of life for the people. Internet is a revolution.
Was corruption a major element in Venezuela?
One of the elements. I think that corruption is one. Of course, corruption has two sides. It's not only the corrupted people, but the institutions that corrupt also. So I think this is a north-south relationship that is very important. But on the other side, I think that people that in the past did not ask for a better situation of their family and their personal situation, today, because of the revolution of internet, of television, of the possibilities, now they want to have a better quality of life. So democracy is not enough to have the voting every 5 years. Chavez offered a changement, and people voted for that changement. Of course, Chavez did not invent changement, but the needs of changement invented Chavez. I mean, a person who failed in the coup d'etat in 92, who was rejected by the public opinion, came in 98 with a project that people wanted to try it. After 5 years, and not only it made a worse situation than it was before, but violation of human rights, desaparecidos, tortures, prison for politicians, and it came not only to fail as a government, but to fail as a democrat too.
Okay, so you have Hugo Chavez who tries to stage a fairly typical Latin American military coup in 1992. Government puts it down, puts him in jail. Years later, he's released. Then in 1998, he's elected president because the people look at him as offering something new that the old political parties were not offering. And he starts with 90% approval, but you seem to be saying, or you are saying, that things have gone downhill. He has much less approval now, and the people would like to see, is it your view that the majority of people would like to see Hugo Chavez leave office?
The bipolarization in Venezuela is so strong that today exists two Venezuelas. And the only remedy to do it is to accept the recalled referendum that Chavez himself introduced in the Constitution. The government is making one problem for every time that there is the needs of convoking this election. So the only way to convoke the popularity or not of Chavez is to let the people vote. And this is all the issue of this confrontation in the last year. The people in the street who want Chavez to end his period constitutionally, because the referendum is a constitutional disposition, and Chavez, who made 8 referendums in the past, every time there was a possibility to make a consultation, he was sure of this 90, 80, then 70%, and finally he knows that he hasn't got the popularity that he has, and he is doing everything to not allow the people to exercise their constitutional right to vote.
Recently, the opponents of Chavez obtained 3.4 million signatures, which is well over 20% of the voters in Venezuela, to call for a referendum that would offer the question, should Chavez continue or not? Now, Chavez seems to be, well, Chavez has refused to allow this referendum.
Absolutely.
Through one maneuver or another. What can happen now? What can the outside world be doing?
Well, I think that the public opinion, the universities, the political leaders, especially the democratic political leaders, have seen the very big problematic situation that Venezuela is today. Of course, Venezuela must solve herself its problem. We, the Venezuelans, must be our actors of our destiny and actors of our future changes. But nevertheless, the solidarity of the international organizations and of democratic opinion is very important for Venezuela today. So I think that the pressure to accomplish, because Chavez wants to keep itself on the legal situation. Of course, it has lost the legitimacy because it doesn't accept the referendum, because he has pressures on the National Assembly, because he has institutions that are against the constitutional right. But he tries to maintain certain legality, even losing the legitimacy. And I think that the public opinion, international public opinion, is very important to allow, finally, the referendum to give the people the possibility of voting and expressing their concern. If Chavez wins, very good, he will stay until 2006. If Chavez loses, well, then there is another alternative for the democratic vision of Venezuela. And this is what is democracy. Democracy is this pendulum. If the Constitution establishes the obligation to make the referendum, Chavez and the government must deliver what the Constitution says.
You, as an experienced diplomat, went through a situation that anyone who works for a government, particularly in the foreign policy area, must go through, in which you find yourself representing a government you don't fully agree with, and finally you come to a point where you say, I can continue no longer. I was reading just last night a book about Mexico. And of course, Mexico's leading intellectual of the 20th century was Octavio Paz, and he was Mexico's ambassador in India in 1968 when there was a great massacre of students in Mexico. And he wrote, "In the face of these most recent events, I have to ask myself if I could continue to serve the government with loyalty and without intellectual reservations. I am not in agreement in the slightest with the methods used to resolve, in reality, to repress the demands of our peoples that have been expressed. I resign." Is that what happened to you? And why did it happen to you on February 27th?
Well, I would say that I agree completely with Octavio Paz in the first part, and I would say the second. In the first part, I resigned 8 times. Private, this is the first time that publicly I confess it, because my contribution was against a series of aspects that were being held in a more and more totalitarian and authoritarian regime, and a series of acts of the administration against the professional activity of a diplomat. I give you an example. You represent the government, that's right, but you represent also the state, the institutions. So you cannot reject a trade union worker institution, a sindicato, if it's not with the government. And there was, you cannot reject the press medias in Venezuela because they're not with the government. You cannot reject the entrepreneurs, the parliamentarians who are in opposition. You represent Venezuela as a whole. And of course, if there is an interparliamentary meeting, you must see parliamentarians of government and of opposition. If you go to an international event of enterprises, you must see everybody. And this is the role of a state, of government, but also of the state. But in Venezuela, there is a second. And not only I could not serve loyally the government, and this is why I quit, but I had to denounce a very, very difficult situation that started after 27 February. Never we saw such a cynicism of not only violating human rights, but denying that they were violated.
What happened? You were in Caracas on that day. Why were you in Caracas, and what happened?
I was for 2 reasons. One of them, and basically to take my oath for the new empowerment for the turnover as ambassador to the United Kingdom. Of course, this is one of the most important moments, the protocol, the presidential protocol. You take the oath for your new destination. I couldn't make the oath. I think that this was very, very hard for me, seeing what had happened the 27th February, to go there to Miraflores and to take the oath of something that really, what I had to do is to cry very loudly against the situation and try to contribute for the unification of a country. You cannot have 2 Venezuelas. And I think that if this sort of plaidoyer, if this sort of denunciation of the violation of human rights, of the denunciation of the dialogue of controversy immediately after there was a meeting, where President Chavez had to the maximum the injuries and insults to friendly countries of the United States, to Spain, to Dominican Republic, to Chile, to Panama, to Costa Rica, and speaking marvelous things about Iraq, about Iran, about Libya. I don't think anything, and a diplomat must have relations worldwide, but you cannot have in your own region, in your own countries, fighting with Colombia and fighting with Central American countries, and go there for a sort of receiving, as he received the president of Zimbabwe as a hero and giving the sword of Simon Bolivar. There are some contradictions. And finally, I would say the question of elections. All these actions to avoid that the Venezuelan people take the disposition of
This came to a head for you, during a meeting of the Group of 15 in which
That's
the
right.
president of Zimbabwe and other countries were in Venezuela, and there was a public protest.
There was a public protest.
What happened on that day?
Well, there were two protests. One, the official protests that were brought into the Hotel Hilton with buses and protected by the Guardia Nacional with all the banners of...
These were pro-Chavez.
Pro-Chavez, of course.
Right.
And the others were against Chavez, who were not only held back 5 kilometers from the hotel, but always also shot, put it in prison with a very repressive action that remembered very much the Pinochet time, the Videla time, and the military time in Latin America. So I said, well, for a diplomat who always believed in democracy, I cannot serve not only loyally, but I have to cry very loudly to say, look what is happening to Venezuela. Look what is happening to a country that was an island of democracy of the continent, and that cynically is becoming a very, very authoritarian regime.
Is Venezuela seen in Latin America as a model in any way? Is Hugo Chavez seen as a model of leadership for other governments?
I wouldn't say that for other governments because of this very controversial way of behaving. But of course...
Not for other governments.
For governments. But I think that there are some movements that see in Chavez, because of his points, there is, since we are in a changing world, as we spoke in the beginning, as I said in the beginning, I think that there is a series of movements that do not know very well what is going to be the architecture of the world tomorrow. And they like somebody who cries very loudly, who has a very anti-imperialistical view, and who goes there and meets with the minorities. But the problem is that this is like two ways and two measures. When Chavez goes to Bolivia, he goes with his friend Evo Morales and receives all the indigenous movements. When he goes to any summit in Canada or a summit in Monterrey, he goes out and receives the people of anti-globalizers and all these movements that exist, and ecological movements, radical movements. But when it's in Venezuela, the president cannot receive the others. So this is a contradiction. How can you go to any country of Latin America or of the world and leave the presidents and go to meet with the civil society? And when it's in your country, you have the tremendous repression against the civil society.
There seems to be a movement in Latin America toward populist governments. How would you compare Chavez in Venezuela with the newly elected, or now a year elected, president of Brazil, Lula? Are they the same? Are they different?
I think this is the difference. Lula, up to now, just now, who fought all his life to make a government of the working leaders, the working class, has a political view, the art of political action, and he has oriented a progressive political orientation, but without closing the National Assembly, without having conflicts with the enterprises, looking how to make his program, but through the dialogue, through a vision that allows to go and speak with the presidents of the developed countries and speak about poverty, and then go to the developing countries and speak of how the solidarity can be made. He goes to South Africa and goes to India and constructs not a North-South division, but a North-South cooperation. And I think that this is a way that a government must orient itself. So I would say that they are completely different, because the more that Lula stays in power up to now, the more he tries to bridge a very constructive way of accomplishing his project and his program. And Chavez, the more that he's in power, the less he's oriented to a dialogue. he's more oriented to confrontation. And I think that for a diplomat, also the art of a dialogue is a necessity. You cannot go around the world fighting with everybody who is not with your position. You have to deliver a situation of harmony, of cooperation, of peaceful existence with your neighbors and with other countries of the world.
What is Chavez's relationship to Fidel Castro?
Very strong, very linked. More and more he makes the admiration for Fidel Castro. He only sees the positive things of Cuba, that there are many positive things in Cuba, but he neglects and rejects all the negative aspects of Cuba. So I think that when the time passes and the involvement of Cuba with Venezuela is stronger and stronger. In the G15, he thought he seemed a sort of ambassador of Cuba. Cuba has very good professional ambassadors. They don't need Chavez to be their ambassador, but he was there supporting all the questions in education, the support that it gives to Africa and Asia in the fields of sportsmen or of doctors, and repeated once and again, the wonderful steps of Cuba to the international community. But Cuba doesn't need Chavez to be his ambassador. They have good ambassadors, and they move quite well, especially in the developing world. So I think that these links are stronger and stronger, and it's not the dependence of Cuba to the Soviet Union as it was before. Now it seems like Venezuela depending from Cuba, from the little island of Cuba.
What's happening in Venezuela is tragic, and we ought to pay attention, but tragedy happens in many countries, and we can afford to ignore it in the United States. But Venezuela has a very particular and specific role relating to the American economy. Venezuela still remains as one of the principal suppliers of foreign oil to the United States. Certainly one of the top 3 or 4, and maybe the largest outside of the Middle East. What has Chavez said about continuing the supply of oil to the United States, and what kind of relationship has he built up with the American oil companies and foreign oil companies?
Well, I think that in these 5 years, one of the positive and intelligent moves that Chavez has done is to continue the credibility of the oil relations, the energetical diplomacy. So in these 5 years of government, there was not affected the provision of oil to the United States. The fact also of the presence of Citgo in the United States is a
explain that. Citgo.
Citgo is an enterprise, a very renowned enterprise of oil industry in Venezuela with refineries.
The Citgo gas stations in the United States are actually owned by Venezuela. By Venezuela.
And I think that one of the very important contributions of Venezuelan oil is that it is refined. Venezuela has a very heavy oil, and it's refined by Citgo. And it's a need for United States to continue all the network of Citgo, and for Venezuela also to have an assured refineries that work with the Venezuelan oil. Unfortunately, on the 29th February, 29, there was for the first time a speech that I am sure that it was more a loud bark than a bite to the United States. But for the first time, he said that he was going to cut the oil distribution to the United States if the United States intervened internally in the Venezuelan affairs. Of course, I think that this is to play with fire, and especially in oil. Oil burns very fast with fire. So up to now, I think that the enterprises has not been affected. On the contrary, they have had good relations, and Venezuela had provided as a permanent client, and I do hope not to kill the la gallina de los huevos de oro, the golden eggs hen. I don't know if it's like that in English, but I think that it's good for the two of us. A good business is a business that for the two countries is good. It's good for United States because they have a neighboring country, because they have a reliable country who sells oil, but it's good for Venezuela because we have a reliable client. So I think that this would be very stupid if Venezuela would break this tradition that exists more than half a century and is mutually beneficial for both countries and for both peoples.
Let me ask this, and we're coming to the end of this interview. Let's assume that tomorrow Hugo Chavez is no longer president of Venezuela. He leaves by one means or another. There's a referendum. Will everything be okay in Venezuela then?
Look, the situation of Venezuela is a very difficult and profound situation. Venezuela will not solve these problems if Chavez goes or if Chavez stays. If Chavez stays, and democratically he could stay, the problem is that we have to work very, very hard because there is a country that the public services collapse, the private sector collapse, the education collapse, the medical hospitals collapse, because the system needed a refreshment. And only through a very hard work of government and opposition, independent if Chavez is in government or opposition, may be solved. So we need a sort of salvation program for Venezuela. Venezuela must be saved of the critical economical, social, political, institutional situation where we are. And the only way to do it is working together. Now the situation is a complete confrontation. Nobody works. There is only confrontation. There's only anti-Chavez and pro-Chavez movements. But Venezuela must think in a profound way of how to deal in the post-Chavez era. Post-Chavez, including Chavez in government or excluding Chavez in government.
You were once Venezuela's ambassador to Israel, and you have described the polarization in Venezuela among Venezuelans as equal to the polarization that exists today between Israelis and Palestinians. That's a very frightening thought.
Very frightening.
Do you have hope for Venezuela? Do you think that this division can be bridged?
Look, I have hope not only for Venezuela, I have hopes also for Israel in the Middle East.
Oh, okay.
And I would say that, of course, we have to work together. There were very big efforts. I was in Israel in the time there was the vision of a new Middle East. Shimon Peres was Minister of Foreign Affairs, and there was a lot of hope in that time to build peacefully, to have a fundraising of Shimon Peres for the Palestinian and for the neighbors. Unfortunately, the situation evolved differently. But I do have hopes, and I think that for Israel, there is a possibility. For Venezuela, I have more hopes, because we have not bridged such a tremendous clash. There were not so many killed, there were not so many dead, and still we can reconstruct Venezuela. When we see, for instance, a situation like Chile's situation, how Chile was also a country divided, but it worked very hardly, and today Chile is one of the most prosperous economy, one of the most including societies, and of course there are things to be done in Chile. But nobody would think in the year 75 or 76 that Chile could unite again. And it's united. So if Chile did, Venezuela has a possibility. And it's the only possibility, by the way. If Venezuela does not unite itself, if the radicalization of the two sectors continue, I think that we are going to a precipice. We are going really very deeply to enter in worst situations. And it's not only the prevention of conflicts, but the action to deliver to the people a better quality of life.
Well, Ambassador Milos Alcalay, you're a very brave man, you're courageous. I know you're planning on going back to Venezuela. We wish you luck, and we wish the Venezuelan people great success in trying to bridge the gap and to end the polarization. Good luck to you, and good luck to your nation.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
This has been Encuentros at the University of California, San Diego, Institute of the Americas. Please let us have your thoughts about this program. Thank you.